I am so excited today because I am speaking with author Richie Unterberger, and I love Richie so much. I have talked to him. I think this is the fourth time I've talked to him, and we are talking about, I'm going to read this title because it's long. We're talking about a book that he wrote back in 2014, but he made it a brand new Kindle, and he combined like two of his books from that time period and then made it into this Kindle ebook, and it is amazing. And it's called Jingle, Jangle, Morning Folk Rock in the 1960s. I learned so much. And I don't know about you guys, but I love rock history. Okay. And he has taught me so much. This book was amazing. And even for the Kindle, like the pictures are so good. And you're looking at the cover right here, but you can only get it in Kindle. So we're going to be talking about that, and I could let him talk like all morning. I have to like really restrain myself because I think you guys just get bored with my questions. But anyway, everybody, here is Richie. Hi, everyone. I am so excited because I am speaking with author Richie Unterberger again, and we are talking about his book called Jingle, Jangle, Morning Folk Rock in the 1960s. It came out in 2014, and thank you so much, Richie, for talking with me about this book.
Thanks for having me on again, Michelle.
Yeah, well, I love talking to you, okay? Because I love talking about rock history, and nobody knows rock history the way you do. I tell you what, this book was proof to me of how much you know.
All right. Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Seriously, I was born in 64. And so like reading this book and trying to understand the music of that era, because my dad was really into music. So I grew up with 60s music all around me. Like it's my first my first experience into music was the Beatles, of course, because I was born in 64, and they came, that's when they got big, was in 64. And of course, he was a huge Beatles fan. So let's start with like, what drove you to write this specific book about the 60s?
I have always been a big fan of folk rock, and the first group that got me heavily into that were the Byrds, who are a big part of the book.
Mm-hmm.
But also, other books that I had done, they had often covered acts from the same era, but it was usually a chapter on some group, a chapter on some artist, a chapter by chapter thing, and those books weren't a story that told how an the story of a career of an artist or how a style developed. And this gave me the chance to tell the story of how folk and rock combined into a new music. And also, nobody had done it before. There were a lot of biographies of Bob Dylan, who's a very important figure in this. And there were some biographies of people like Paul Simon, who were also a big part of folk rock, but not a book that examined overall how these styles very unpredictably came together. And I think they took each separate style, folk and rock, to a place that neither could have gotten to on their own. So it wasn't just a story about a musical fusion or the birth of a style, but also about how the social changes of the time helped drive this creation of an entirely new musical world.
Yeah, and that is absolutely what I got. I learned so much. And everyone out there, you're looking at the cover, but if you've never bought one of Richie's books, you need to get them, because he has not only the best stories of any book that I've ever read about rock and roll, but also the pictures are just amazing. I always love your pictures in books. I mean, you go to great extreme to make sure that we're not just getting stories, but we're also getting a visual experience as we're reading your book. And I love that.
Thanks. And this is an advantage, by the way, of ebooks. I do want to mention that the book that we're talking about now, Jingle Jangle Morning, it's actually an ebook combination of a 2-volume uh, series on folk rock that I did as print books about 15 years ago. And those books, they're theoretically still in print. You can only get Jingle Jangle Morning as an ebook, but a great advantage is that when you republish books in ebook form, you can add a lot of content. And Jingle Jangle Morning has about 40,000 words that are not in the print versions. And that includes the big section at the end where I give liner notes to what I would consider the best box set that could be compiled of 1960s folk rock, and I have detailed comments about each track. Those comments, that section is not in the print version, but also in the last 15 years, I've interviewed a few more people, some of them quite important, like Dion, who did Abraham Martin, and John, who I wasn't able to interview for the first book. Sometimes people contacted me with additional information. Sometimes I found out through other channels, unpredictable information. So it's a substantially updated and revised edition.
Yeah, of course I have the Kindle edition and it is fantastic. Like I was amazed at how much work you put into making, because a lot of the ebooks that have pictures and have the other features you were talking about are not as well done. This book was so well done as an ebook and so much fun, because that was always the reason to go get the hardcover, was like, oh well, the ebook pictures aren't good, and it just doesn't. But the fact that you could put those things on at the end, and all these pictures were in such a way done that they was just as experiencing one of your hard copy, which I love your hard copy books so much, and I display them because they're so beautiful. But let's start at the beginning of this book, Richie. You open this up with the 1965 Newport Folk Festival. I want you to tell everybody why you opened up the book with this.
The 1965 Newport Folk Festival marked the first time Bob Dylan played electric rock as an adult. He had played in some rock bands in high school, but when he started his career as a serious professional musician, he only performed folk music, and only as a solo performer, playing acoustic guitar, sometimes harmonica, sometimes on his record piano too. And this was considered a radical change for Bob Dylan. And even though he had already put out some electric records in 1965, electric rock records, doing this in concert, but also at a folk festival, was bound to cause controversy. And not just my book, but quite a few books and documentaries have reported about this, how the reception from the audience was mixed. And there was some booing because a lot of the folk community wanted Bob Dylan to stay a folk musician, hopefully doing more of his protest songs and social commentary songs. And he was changing, obviously. One reason I started the book with that chapter about that concert, and I interviewed some people, not Bob Dylan, but interviewed some people who were there or were helping to organize the concert, doing the sound and so forth, is that in quite a few histories, this is seen a little misleadingly, I think, as this is the birth of folk rock. Bob Dylan kind of did this single-handedly. He changed his style to rock, and that opened the floodgates for a new form of music, and it came out of nowhere. And I don't think that is the case. I think it's more like this is an announcement to the world that folk rock has arrived, because other musicians in the year or so before this appearance in July 1965 had been working along the same lines. And in fact, the most notable of those, the Byrds, had already taken a Bob Dylan song with an electric rock arrangement to #1 with Mr. Tambourine Man. That's really the birth of folk rock as a popular phenomenon. But the Byrds and some other musicians, some of whom are pretty unheralded, like Fred Neil and Richard and Mimi Farina, were tentatively experimenting with this. The Byrds were really the first act to pull this off well. And Bob Dylan almost at around the same time. Did that in the studio on half of his first 1965 album, Bringing It All Back Home, and then on a full electric album 6 months later, which would come out after the Newport Folk Festival appearance. Just to wrap up the significance of the Newport Folk Festival appearance, it's hard to comprehend in a way 53 years later why roughly half, say, of the audience was booing, was so displeased, because Bringing It All Back Home was a very popular record. As an album, it made the top 10, and it had a whole album side of electric rock. And it wasn't like, oh, I'm just adding a little bit of electric bass here. Some of the songs like Maggie's Farm or Subterranean Homesick Blues were just loud rock and roll. And he had just released Like a Rolling Stone, which would become his biggest hit. So it was not a secret that he was doing this. And it's strange that an audience would think that, well, even though these records are out, he's not going to actually change. And he's going to stay a folk musician, especially when he's at a folk festival. He's not going to insult us with his loud rock and roll music. Also, talking to people at the event, some were clear that it wasn't everybody booing. Some people said they loved it, and others said, well, I had no objection to Bob Dylan doing electric music, but the sound at the event, at least when you were in the audience, was really bad. And that's what some of the people who were listening were upset about. So it was a very complex event that's not as absolute as it's often portrayed. But it was a good opener, too, to the whole story, which I then started with the next chapter, starting with the folk revival and how a lot of those musicians moved from folk music to electric music, and especially after Bob Dylan and the Byrds, it was a flood of musicians, many of whom had big hits like Donovan and Simon and Garfunkel, the Mamas and the Papas, Love and Spoonful, but quite a few who are relatively overlooked, and I enjoyed the opportunity to weave those stories into the narrative too.
Oh my gosh. I mean, Richie, you are like the ultimate storyteller with this. I seriously, my favorite chapter was the second one, was Meet the Beatles, because even though this book isn't about the Beatles, it's like how the things I learned about the Beatles and then the folk music, it was my favorite chapter. But, and maybe because I love the Beatles, but, explain to me, explain to everyone, how significant they were to the folk music revolution in the 60s.
You can't overstate their influence, even though they were not from a folk background,
right?
Like the huge majority of folk rock musicians. When I don't want to knock any other historians by name, but there are a good number of them who seem to view Bob Dylan as the main instigator of this change. I interviewed well over 100 people for the book, not just musicians, but some producers, record label owners, journalists who were around when this was happening. With the musicians, I have to say that it wasn't what you might expect from reading some of those other interpretations, that, oh, when we heard Bob Dylan doing this, we realized we had to do this too. I'd say like 90% of them, and that's not an exaggeration, cited the Beatles and the British bands that followed them as the main inspiration for them to go electric, to change from folk musicians to rock musicians. And Bob Dylan was considered important, but remember that his electric records didn't start to get widely circulated until almost a year and a half after the Beatles had their first hits in the United States. And it wasn't just the Beatles' music, it was also the way they looked and their lifestyle. It just looked so fun. And some of the stories that illustrate this from the chapter that you're probably indirectly referring to, I spoke to some musicians in Los Angeles who remembered when A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles movie, of course, came out in the summer of 1964, and that they would see it over and over. They would go to this movie theater in Los Angeles that had screenings after midnight, and that was the best time to go because when it was screened during the day or on the weekends, and teenagers who were the bulk of the Beatles audience could go, of course, they would scream at the screen. It sounds kind of weird too. I mean, screaming at the concerts you would expect, but they would actually scream while the movie was happening. So it was actually hard to hear the dialogue in the soundtrack. And the dialogue is very funny and brings out the Beatles' personalities. So when you went after midnight, there were no kids, probably very few kids anyway, and you could hear everything. But even aside from taking that special time of the day to make sure they could appreciate the movie, they saw it over and over because they loved it so much they like almost memorized what was happening. And David Crosby, who I unfortunately was not able to interview, but he has said, I went out of that screening, watching the movie, like, just jumping with joy almost, because it just looked like so much fun to be in a rock band. Mm. And another aspect of that chapter that was interesting to me, it's not like, oh, we want to be like the Beatles, so tomorrow we're going to play songs like the Beatles. Most of these musicians had very little, sometimes no experience on electric instruments, and they weren't very cheap either. So at the outset, some of them were actually miking their acoustic guitars so they would be louder, but that's not going to create the same effect as A Hard Day's Night, the song by the Beatles, say, that starts with that really emphatic ringing electric guitar chord. So it was a gradual process. Also, but the next day, these guys still look like, we look at the photos now, they look like kind of like dorks. They look like these wholesome, incredibly clean-cut college kids with really short hair and very conservative dress. And it wasn't like, oh, the next day we can say, hey, we look like the Beatles. They had to work towards that over the period of a few months. And Roger McGuinn, who I did talk to for the book, I think that was the most important interview I did. He was specifically inspired to get a 12-string electric guitar, a Rickenbacker model, from watching A Hard Day's Night. You don't think of this as like telecommunications, but remember, there's no internet then. Right. Yeah, you can see some pictures of the Beatles in the paper, maybe see a few TV appearances, but just getting the elementary information. How does George Harrison get that guitar chord at the beginning of the song, A Hard Day's Night, which also opens the movie? He's using the specific 12-string electric guitar. And Roger McGuinn modeled the guitar that he got after what he actually saw on the screen. And with that guitar, which has that ringing sound, the electric 12-string, the jingle jangle, it's actually called, that combines some of the best aspects of rock and folk without even, having a song or a lyric yet, because 12-string guitars were used in folk music to produce a fuller, more resonant sound. But even the best acoustic 12-string guitar couldn't get the volume and the overtones you can get on an electric 12-string. And Roger McGuinn became the best player of that instrument, the electric folk rock guitar.
Wow. See, this is what I'm talking about, everybody. He has so many stories like this in this book. And, it makes me smile while I'm reading your book. I always smile when I'm reading your books because, I don't know, we've kind of lost that era of like stories, I feel like. And you tell this one story, and I'm not sure what chapter it's in, but you talk about people who, when they first heard Elvis, right? Like they remember that moment. And then when they first heard the Beatles, they remember that moment. And I was thinking, that's another thing that's kind of lost today. Like, can you think of anybody today that you hear of and you're just like, wow, they're going to, like, music is going to change now. Like, it just, because there's so much out there in so many different ways of getting it. Like, I don't know. I wanted to know what you thought about that because I loved when I was reading that story that you told about it.
Yeah, I can't think of anyone, not just from the last year or two, from the last decade or two.
Right.
Who would have that impact. And in part that's because, as you said, there's so much music now, and in the 50s and 60s with Elvis and the Beatles, for a lot of the audience, the initial exposure to music would have been on the radio. It's not often that way now. It might be
Right.
on the internet pretty often. But there was also just a lot less to choose from, a lot less that had happened. And also, rock music itself was so much newer. Of course, it was brand new when Elvis Presley had his first hits, and it wasn't that old when the Beatles came. So there was so much new territory to be explored. Now in rock music, a great deal of it has been. So it's hard to imagine how anyone can have the same impact that those two acts and some others had, where they sounded totally new and unprecedented. But I will say, in history, these are things you can't predict. I mean, in everything, not just music, but certainly music. And maybe in the near future or the distant future, there will be an artist who has that impact. Nobody's ever sounded like this, or maybe even no one's looked like this. And this is just amazingly exciting to experience for the first time. But it can't be predicted by its very nature. If it could be predicted, the music industry would try to manufacture that. But one of the reasons the Beatles and Elvis and many others came across as so fresh is that they weren't manufactured. They weren't devised by a business plan.
Yes. I would say if I had to, if somebody had to hold a gun to my head and say when was the last time, music changed the way you thought about it, it probably was Thriller because of Quincy Jones and Michael Jackson. And even though that wasn't considered rock, like at least it was different and it changed some things about music. But since then, I can't really think of anything like that has had that much of an impact.
And when you go back to the impact of the Beatles on folk rock musicians, for some of the people I spoke with, it's almost like asking them about the JFK assassination, which happened to be
Right.
just 2 months before the Beatles hit the United States. But some of them remember exactly where they were the first time that it came over the radio or a jukebox or something. And the memories of some of them were like, when we heard this, we knew that things had changed because it was that different, even without having seen pictures of the Beatles, which amplified that
Right.
because it just sounded so different. And that was a big instigator for a lot of these musicians changing direction. They had been doing folk music, some of them for 4 or 5 years as their principal passion. And now they wanted to do something very different. But even if they wanted to imitate the Beatles, it came out differently because of their folk music backgrounds.
Yeah. So, after I've read so many of your books now, and I love the experience of each one of them. And this one was amazing. And I always tell you this because, like, when we talked about The Who, and, I was like, I read one of your books that are like, I don't even know how many pages because they're long, but I never feel like it's that. Like it never gets boring. It never gets like every chapter is so fresh and such new stuff and the interviews you do and so I'm like, what are you working on right now? Are you working on a new book?
I'm not working on a new book, and I can tell you just a little bit about what I'd like to do.
Awesome.
In rock music, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and even before I moved here, which was 35 years ago when I was 21, I was a big fan of groups like Jefferson Airplane
Oh,
and Janis Joplin with Big Brother and the Holding Company. And living here, of course, I have access to a lot of research I can do firsthand, and I would like to do a very big book about the story of the music, not just the big stars. People know about Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead and Santana, who are worth covering, of course, but as I did with the folk rock book, many people also working in the same area with the same unpredictable evolutions who make good music, important contributions, who have good stories, but they're kind of
yeah.
almost totally unheard, it seems, because the superstars get so much attention. I
I
haven't been able, and I have not been able to find a publisher for this who wants to put out a book that has a lot of text and a lot of photos. Um, I would have a co-author too, by the way, who has a huge archive of this stuff. So we're considering self-publishing it, and I have not done that before for a print book. So that's a very involved process, a lot of which has nothing to do with writing and research. It's kind of like researching a business model. But that is a goal of mine. A book that it looks like I'm going to do, but it's not, for the most part, music related, would be part of a series of coffee table books that are huge photo books. I mean, really big, like 500-page, very large size photo books that tell the story of a city. And I will be doing the volume on San Francisco, not just the text, which wouldn't actually be that much because these are photo books, but all the photo research. So even though that's not what I usually do, I would be pretty excited to do that because I do have other interests besides music. History in general is a big interest of mine. So I hope that comes together. I don't have a contract yet, but if it does, if it arrives as expected, that would be out in about a couple of years.
Well, you know what? I know like at least the self-publishing is out there. And I'm telling you, people would be coming after you once you start, like, because I know so many authors that they go self-publish and then it's like, then the publishers come after them. So I really think that that's probably what would happen because your books are so amazing. Like I said, the pictures, I don't know why publishers get scared of that because I know as a reader, that's what I want to read. But I do think that it kind of throws them sometimes. But, I'll be out there promoting whatever you do because I love you and I love your book so much. So, whatever you decide to do, I'll be right there with you.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Yes. So everybody, the links are going to be listed below for Jingle Jangle Morning. It is an experience of the 60s like you've never had. And yes, it is all based on the folk rock, but there are so many other stories. It's so much more involved than what you think just about folk rock. I learned so much and I can't wait to get this out to everybody. Richie, thank you so much. And anytime you want to talk about one of your books, I'm right here. You know where to find me.
Okay, thanks, Michelle, for having me on again.
Yes, absolutely. It made my day. So you have a great one, Richie.
All right, thanks.
Yep, bye-bye. It was
Bye.
awesome. I'm telling you, I could talk to him for hours, okay? His book, if you love like rock history, the stories he tells are truly, you just don't get them anywhere else, okay? And I think that I know a lot until I read one of his books and then I'm like, I know nothing, okay? But he knows how much I love him and I will read anything he writes. That's just how it goes because he's that amazing. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Richie, for talking with me again. And I cannot wait until our next talk.